Welcome back to the YouTube channel, everyone. We're continuing our series on a people's history of the United States, chapter 22. So the chapter is called, the Unreported Resistance. So I'll have to say, I'm only doing 14 chapters, and I skipped one. That was my least favorite, surprises. And this was probably my second least favorite. And it's just kind of to me, it doesn't really fit well in the larger narrative of the book. So I don't really know. And I'm going to talk about that too, kind of really what I dislike most about this book in a moment. Um, okay. So you can't win them all, right? I have some bad chapters too that I wrote that I would admit to. So one of the things about the unreported resistance, one thing Zinn talks about is this permanent adversarial culture. Those tens of millions who refuse to go along with political consensus of capitalism, military wealth, and power concentrated into a few. That's in essence what this chapter is about. It's about the 80s and the 90s. This national movement included resistance or, so the resistance movements against the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the 1980s. Zinn mentions the women, 140 women were arrested in Washington surrounding the Pentagon shortly after Reagan participated. 2,000 participated, 140 arrested. In 1981, local elections in Boston approved the increase in federal spending on social programs by reducing the amount of our tax dollars spent on nuclear weapons and programs of foreign intervention. So there were, although there wasn't movements in the Washington D.C., there were local movements against this, basically proliferation of nuclear weapons and military spending. So in 1982 was the largest political demonstration in U.S. history in Central Park to bring an end to the arms race. Um, so the George Kosciuszko was the architect of the A bomb, the atomic bomb, and he talked about organizing mass movement to stop nuclear proliferation. In 1983, there were 79% that favored a nuclear freeze. In less than 3 years, a remarkable change of opinion happened after the fall of Russia. So there was the Iranian hostage crisis, and as well as the invasion of Afghanistan by Russia. So this is what I was kind of alluding to. I didn't really say it sensitively enough last chapter when I was talking about why Zinn focuses on El Salvador. Personally, when it comes to writing, you only have so much time and so much paper. So you want to focus on what matters most in that time period. And I think Zinn really made a misstep in many ways by focusing on, for example, like El Salvador. He probably had several pages on it, not only in this chapter, but the last chapter. He talked about this dictatorship being a military we were giving military aid to a dictatorship. This aid became a flashpoint. He talks about these four nuns were assassinated. Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated. There were death squads sponsored by the U.S. government, and only 16% favored foreign aid to El Salvador. Now, let me tell you what really bothered me about most about Zinn's book is, okay, for example, why focus on El Salvador and a lot of couple other things in the book when you could have spent more time on Iraq. You could have mentioned OPEC. He didn't mention OPEC. He didn't mention really public schools that much. For example, the No Child Left Behind. He doesn't really mention. Zinn also doesn't really talk about Mexican American history or Latino history very well, if at all. He barely scratches the surface on Asian American history and Native American history. So I think that's what really rubbed me wrong with this book in general, is he, at the expense of these more important things, Zinn focuses on El Salvador and all these other things. And I just felt like that was the weakest part of his book. So when I come across these chapters, like unreported resistance and surprises, I really think they're the weakest part of this book in general. And that's why I took out surprises and would probably take this chapter out if it weren't for a couple of things. So what I do like about this chapter, though, on a positive note, is we talk about Reagan. So Reagan, Ronald Reagan is a hero to many Republicans, and I really don't understand why. Um, Reagan did not support economic sanctions against South Africa in '86. He obviously did not want to see the white ruling minority of the Southern South Africa displaced by the radical African Congress. And I'll just say this. So anyways, let me finish that sentence. But public opinion swayed Congress to create legislation overriding Reagan's veto. So Reagan didn't really care about minorities, black and brown people, in my opinion. He cut the Native American the Bureau of Indian Affairs budget by 1/3. So a lot of the minorities, black and brown folks, suffered under Reagan administration. So it depends on what side of the fence you live on. And here I'll just make a statement. Actors do not make good politicians. So we recently had an actor in the White House. We had an actor. Matthew McConaughey's want to be a governor of Texas, and here's why that's bad. So here's why actors don't make good politicians. First of all, I studied political science for many, many years, most of my adult life. And I would liken this to a brain surgeon. So people don't realize this, but politicians and study their entire lives to understand, for example, the structure of the United Nations. How does the United Nations work? It's very complicated. The International Monetary Fund, the history of individual regions and individual nations will take almost a lifetime to understand. For example, to understand the Middle East, it took insane amount of hours for me to understand Japanese, U.S. relation history, U.S. Asian relation history, to understand the relationship between Latin America, immigration. Immigration, I still don't understand, and I've been studying it forever. It's so complicated. So this is why, I heard the thing where someone said once, if I'm going to get my brain surgery on my brain, I want a brain surgeon to do it. So, and this is why it's important that we actually get politicians who've been studying and know policy, no foreign policy, no domestic policy in office. So that's just my spiel. I guess it's not really related to this chapter, but I'll just add my own little thing. So Reagan to me was not a good president. He cut many social programs. At this point in time, he took away federal funds for the arts. Teachers strike across the country lasted a week in 7 states. Well, let me just state this. There's not many presidents I do like, by the way. Just to qualify that previous statement. So at this point in time, so all these social programs are getting cut. Teachers are striking across the country, lasted a week. Unemployment demonstrations in 20 cities in 1983. At 1983, blacks demonstrate against police brutality in Miami. And at this point in time, blacks continue to fall between the cracks. So they're at 50% unemployment plus, 50 plus unemployment. Government responds to poverty how? By building more jails. So that's why America incarcerates more people than anyone in the world. I think 2 million people, or don't quote me on that, something crazy like that, are incarcerated at any given time in the United States. So instead of addressing poverty, what we do is we incarcerate people, and we don't really care about rehabilitation too. If you study, like for example, Norway and Dutch countries, where their incarceration system is on rehabilitation, and so they don't have a lot of repeat offenders. So those in the margins of society are most affected by poverty. So there's a thing here where Zinn talks about children versus guns. Okay. So yeah, I don't even know I'll just mention this. So I really didn't like this chapter. So my notes are bad. That's when I know if I don't like something. I look down at my notes and I'm like, what was I doing? Anyways. So one of the things Zinn talks about is this idea of, and I agree with this, is that voting participation has crashed and gone down and down and down after Vietnam, after all these things. People are just disarrayed and disillusioned with politics. So they said, forget about it. So we talk about this idea of landslide and overwhelming victories for Reagan and Bush. But the voting age that uh, the population of voting age that voted was around 54 to 59% between Reagan and Bush years. And so that means only 30% of the population voted for them and got them in office. So we're not really getting, so if a president is winning by 30% of the voting age that the population that was voting age, it's not really a landslide, because what's happening is people aren't included in the political process. So we're getting the minority is voting in our presidents. Okay, so the bipartisan consensus largely was against the poor in the 80s and the 90s. So although Reagan, we can't give him too much credit. Although he was cutting these social programs, the bipartisan consensus of the Democrats and the Republicans was to blame, because they're the Senate, they're in the House. They were voting unanimously to make these cuts. For example, when it came to cutting the Native American budget, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it was unanimous, and they didn't reinstate it. So yes, Reagan, he was part of it, but you have to look at both parties as responsible for making these cuts to the poor in the 80s and the 90s. Again, in the 70s and 60s, we had these gains in the social programs, and in the 80s and 90s, you have a reversal of that. So I always tell people the pendulum swings left and right. As you get gains, liberal, you'll have a reaction to the right, to the conservative, and then you'll have another, swing. The pendulum will swing back. So you're always on this like forever back and forth with politics. It swings back and forth to the right and the left. So anyway, so right now we're swinging to the right. Okay, so people did not want more taxes, and that's really important to mention right now. The tax situation, still we don't want to be taxed more. We're already being taxed too much for many people, but we did favor. So Zinn talks about something very interesting right now about favoring a Canadian style healthcare system. So 61% favored that. And healthcare continues to be on top of the important issues. What the Canadian style system is, it's a single payer where you bypass insurance companies. And this is really what is problematic with the United States, is we have these insurance companies that are hijacking the system and raising the prices. So what we'll pay for a surgery in the United States will be 4 times that of the same surgery in Canada. I think people would still favor this if they understood the system, but I think people don't understand it. It is complicated. So at this point in time, and we still have this, debate back and forth, but I think the consensus was, and maybe still is, maybe it's different now, but the Democrats nor the Republicans don't care about reforming the medical system. And this is why it's so important to have a educated population, because what happens is the poor U.S. education actually is an aid to the rich. So by us being poorly educated helps the rich out, because by keeping the public ignorant, we don't know what is good for ourselves. And so I guess I'm including myself with the rest of the population. And so we must be informed, a better informed public to know what policies are good and bad. So our education is kind of a feedback loop, our poor education. So neither party is willing to make major cuts in the military budget at this point. So one of the things that happens often in politics is when you frame a question, you manipulate public opinion. So when you talk about welfare, for example, 23% support it. But when you talk about helping the poor, 64 support it. So that's an interesting statistical fact. So let me quote this. So something amiss with a political system supposed to be democratic, in which the desires of the voters are repeatedly ignored. They could be ignored with impunity so long as the political system was dominated by two parties, both tied to corporate wealth and not capable of dealing with fundamental economic illness, whose roots were deeper than any single presidency. This is why I believe, this is why I don't like the American political system as a two-party system. When you study French and German political systems, they have a multi-party system. And so I think a lot of people don't identify with the Democrats or Republicans. I would be one of those. And this is why I think we need a multi-party system that has representation. And this is why I think the American political system doesn't work, is we don't have enough representation, enough parties. And the parties in the end, like Zinn would say, are actually the same when it comes to being fundamentally dominated by the being tied to corporate wealth and the military and all these other things that we're going to cover more in the next chapter, by the way. So 1,000 voices of protest made no important movement for radical change. So the Dems would help the poor, but not tamper with the economic system that put corporate profit before human need. So the Democrats, the Dems was the Democrats. So although the Democrats are the party of the poor, so-called, they're no different than the Republicans most of the time, because they're tied to corporate wealth just like the Republicans are. So, and that's one of the things that came up recently in the last, decade, is how do we get money out of Washington? For example, in Germany, there's no money tied to the economic, you can't donate. All the money that is donated, all the money that's to support all the parties is by the taxpayer, and they all get equal amount. So there's a way we can take money out of politics, but we just don't do it. And I think if they did a study too on who wins the presidency and who wins elections, it always who has the most money. So until we get money out of politics, we're never going to fix our broken political system. So at this point in time, 1% of the 1% on 1/3 of the wealth, 33%. There were 30 to 40 million people impoverished. In the 60s, social programs, Medicare. Yeah, okay. I have an interesting, I don't know what Zinn was trying to say there. So in the 60s, I'll just say it and maybe it means something to you. But again, my notes are pretty bad on this chapter, so my apologies. So it says in the 60s, social programs, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps maintain historic American maldistribution of resources. And I probably should have put a little more into that sentence, but hopefully you know what that sentence means, because I felt it was important. Okay, so last page. The labor movements in the 80s and 90s was considerably weakened by the decline of manufacturing, by the flight of factories to other countries, by the hostility of the Reagan administration and its appointees on the National Labor Relations Board. The labor movement as a whole, much diminished, was struggling for survival. At this point in time, so people know Jack Ryan by the movie. Jack Ryan came out. He was a disgruntled former FBI employee, to tell the truth, kind of a whistleblower. And then there was a guy named David McMichael of the CIA that was kind of a Jack Ryan type person who openly criticized these organizations. So the legacy of the Vietnam War continued. And this is really where it starts today, where we question authority, and not necessarily war, but especially authority. I think the war thing goes back and forth, but the Vietnam War, really, that was a turning point where Americans forever will question the authority of the United States government. This legacy plagued the Reagan and Bush administration. There was a sea change in domestic attitudes and a breakdown in political consensus and foreign policy. So before that, like during the Cold War, there was a consensus with foreign policy. After Vietnam, there was no consensus. The foreign policy consensus was breaking down. There was a consensus. So, okay. Then he talks about Ron Kovic, born on the 4th of July, talked about protesting war. Quote, when will we all learn? Patriotic fervor changed. So you now don't have like this consensus for war. Now you have kind of more of a resistance to war. Okay. And I think, okay, oh, I got one more little thing here. So at this point in time, the US consumed around 30% of the world's oil. War fervor evaporates after the Gulf War, and Bush, his support dropped steeply as economic conditions deteriorated and he lost the election. So typically, if the economy is doing well, you have a really good chance of being elected. If it's doing poorly, that probability of being reelected goes down significantly, as we saw in this last election, by the way, the 2020. I think if the economy was strong in 2020, I think Trump probably would have won, but it was the economy that sank his ship, just like it sank Bush's ship. Okay, so all right, so let me make sure I'm not missing anything. I thought I had something. Okay. There was some percentage stuff I thought that was interesting. So what percentage of the population in the late 1980s and early 1990s wanted to pay more taxes? Answer: Americans wanted to pay as little as possible. Would people pay more taxes to clean up the environment? 54% said yes. What percentage of the population in the 80s and 90s wanted to place an extra tax on millionaires? 84%. That's almost everyone. Probably that 16% is the millionaires. What percentage of the population wanted to raise the capital gains tax? In 51%. Capital gains tax is when you sell a property and you make a profit. So that profit is called capital gains, unless you buy a new property. Wanted. So how many people, what percentage in the 80s and 90s wanted a Canadian healthcare style system? 61%. What percentage of the population in the 80s and the 90s wanted to cut defense spending in half? 59%. It'd be interesting to see that data today. So, okay. And last thing I'll say is, yeah, actually that's good. All right. So that takes care of this chapter. So next chapter is the most important chapter of the book, chapter 23. It is Zinn's thesis, and I will see you in a bit. Take care, everybody.